John Harbaugh may be out in Baltimore, but I think he's going to be in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to Locked On Falcons, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by FanDuel. Before tip-off, check out the FanDuel app and see what's dropping during NBA Happy Hour every Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com. Still going strong here for entering year 10 of the humble host of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. On today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we'll be talking about why the Falcons' top GM candidate, rumored to be maybe perfect for that role because he's the polar opposite of Terry Fontenot. We'll break down Kirk Cousins' restructure. We didn't know if Kirk would be willing to restructure, and Kirk did. He said, basically giving the Falcons an ultimatum with that restructure, cut me or commit to me, and we'll break that down. But let's talk about the news of the day. The big fish that just got released into the river or pond, whatever you want to call it, the lake, that is John Harbaugh, who has been fired by the Baltimore Ravens. Now, there's other coaching news with the Falcons where they have formally requested an interview with Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph. We'll probably talk more about that on tomorrow's episode. You know, when we talk about the competent coordinator versus the CEO type head coach, Vance Joseph firmly is in that competent coordinator category. But when we talk about the CEO type head coach, there's probably not a better option than John Harbaugh, formerly of the Baltimore Ravens. His resume kind of speaks for itself. 18 years in Baltimore, 13 winning seasons, 12 playoff appearances, 4 conference championships, 1 Super Bowl win, averaging 10 wins per season, the 4th best win percentage over the last 18 years for the Ravens. Obviously spearheaded by one of the best defenses in the NFL in that period of time. Fewest points allowed over the last 18 years combined, the Ravens. And, they've scored a lot of points too. 6 points scored. A lot of that been a big uptick with Lamar Jackson. But it's been the picture of stability. He was in the same coaching cycle hired when the Falcons hired Mike Smith. And Baltimore's had 1 coach since then, and the Falcons have had 4 coaches since then. So the picture of stability. So it's an impressive resume. It's exactly the type of resume that we all expect Arthur Blank to covet. He's been searching and chasing proven winners basically the entire time he's been in Atlanta, and this feels like a golden opportunity. But we discussed this before the Rams game, where we talked about how the perception of this coaching cycle was down. And, you may find teams, including the Atlanta Falcons, maybe holding on to their coaches this offseason because they're kind of hoping that someone like a John Harbaugh, and we mentioned, and this came, I believe, from James Palmer, John Harbaugh, Mike Tomlin, Sean McDermott, Kevin Stefanski as guys that teams will covet, but might not become available this cycle. Now, Harbaugh and Stefanski have. And some people think McDermott and Tomlin could still become available depending on what happens this weekend. But we talked about that in the context of that may be a compelling reason for Arthur Blank to not fire Raheem, because he wants one of these proven winners, because he's been chasing this type of coach for Atlanta for 20 plus years now. And that he'd be willing to retain Raheem for 1 more year in the hopes that 2027 would be an opportunity for him to go get a John Harbaugh or a Mike Tomlin type of coach. But now, obviously, John Harbaugh is available, and I think the expectation is that the Falcons will be more than willing to back up the Brinks truck, in order to make him, if not the highest paid head coach, one of the highest paid head coaches in the NFL, in order to entice him down to Atlanta. We'll see. Harbaugh's going to have options. He's 63. He may decide to take a break for a year. That's something that we've seen a lot of coaches do. And in general, with Andy Reid being probably the biggest exception, I would say, again, I'd have to do a little bit more research, but it does feel like that tends to lead to better outcomes than when a coach immediately gets fired and goes to another team. So, that plays a part in it, but I'd have to do more research to see if that is true. And is it being, is it the Ron Riveras and the Herm Edwardses of the world that are, holding that back and whatnot, that makes that perception the reality. But he is an older coach, so he may decide to take a break for a year, but he's probably going to have his pick of teams. And so it's really less a question of, do the Atlanta Falcons want John Harbaugh? It's more, does John Harbaugh want to be in Atlanta? And we saw a tweet from Adam Schefter shortly after Harbaugh's dismissal was announced that Harbaugh's agent already got calls from 7 teams, and there are 7 current head coaching openings, including Baltimore, which, if my math is correct, that means that a team that currently does not have an opening also called John Harbaugh's agent to sniff around whatnot. And so we can assume pretty safely the Falcons are one of those teams. But again, he'll likely have his pick of opportunities, and ultimately it will be determined if Atlanta is the right job. And I know that's an ongoing topic of debate, and you'll hear various other shows talk about, where do the Falcons sit, in terms of are they the most coveted job? And you'll see this person tweet why they are and why they think this is and why other people think it's the worst job. I think that it's all subjective. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, the only person opinions that matters is the person that the Falcons hire, right? Like, that's the only person where it comes to that opinion. I typically think that depending on what your criteria is, if you're looking at everything outside of the quarterback position, I think you can make the argument that Atlanta is a coveted job compared to some of the other ones. But when you look at the path to getting a quarterback, that's what sort of hurts the Falcons, I think, potentially in the eyes of potential candidates and whatnot. So we'll see. So the issue with Harbaugh, I don't know, issues maybe not the right word, but as a CEO head coach, so much of his success is going to hinge on who he hires as the right coordinators, right? John Harbaugh's background, obviously comes from a coaching family. His brother Jim is a coach. His dad was also a coach. But his background prior to his hiring in Baltimore was a special teams coach, right? We didn't call him CEO coaches back when he was hired in 2008, but that's been sort of the nomenclature over these last few years. But we've seen one of the strengths of Harbaugh was being able to find good coordinators over the course of those 18 years, 7 different OCs, 7 different DCs over that period of time. Some very successful guys like Jim Caldwell, Gary Kubiak, Chuck Pagano, Mike McDonald would go on to become head coaches after leaving Baltimore. Arguably his best ones were some of his more recent ones with Todd Monken, currently the offensive coordinator, but probably no longer in Baltimore, and Mike McDonald before he went to Seattle. But, one of the things he often did was he would hire former head coaches for his offensive coordinators. Now, I think basically, I can't remember who was the first guy where that was not the case, but like up until I think Greg Roman, I think was the first OC that he had hired that was not previously a head coach. And in theory, the reason why that matters is just because that in theory gives you a little bit more stability, because those guys are less likely to get poached for a second as retreads than a up and coming hot young OC and whatnot. But, I think the coordinator hire is potentially going to matter a lot. I think quarterback is going to matter a lot, because I think a big part of John Harbaugh's success in Baltimore in comparison to his predecessors, someone like a Brian Billick, is that they had a lot more stability at quarterback under John Harbaugh than they did under Brian Billick. Now, Billick had success, but he was much more of a roller coaster. Harbaugh was, pretty consistently successful. And when they had down years in Baltimore, it was mostly because either quarterbacks got injured and then they would basically win 8 games. They would go 8-8 or 8-9 or something like that, including this year, right? But, that's going to be a big part of I think, the conversation. 10.5 years of Joe Flacco, 7.5 years of Lamar Jackson at the quarterback position. So, I say all that just because I don't think it's just automatic that like, oh, John Harbaugh can go to any other team and repeat the success that he had in Baltimore and average 10 wins and go to the playoffs, 60-70% of the time and win a Super Bowl, over the next, 5 to 7 years or something like that, which again is obviously what you want to see happen. But I don't know if it's necessarily guaranteed, because some of these factors, like who's his coordinator going to hire, who's his quarterback going to be, especially when we're talking about in Atlanta, I think are going to matter a lot. But certainly, I think when you talk about the resume, the level of competence that John Harbaugh has displayed over the last 2 decades, just a level of competence that we just haven't really had in Atlanta from a coaching standpoint. And I'm just reminded of the conversations I was having with the Locked On Chargers guys when they were hiring Jim Harbaugh 2 years ago. And it's like a similar conversation, right? You know, the Falcons and Chargers are basically, you know, the South and West Coast version of the same team. Minnesota's the North version. Unfortunately, the Jets are the Northeast version of the Falcons. And so you're hoping, as we've seen the success of a team like the Chargers, you know, that John Harbaugh can do a similar thing in Atlanta. But a big part of that with the Chargers has been obviously having the quarterback, right, in Justin Herbert. And so that's going to be, again, as we've discussed before, and we'll continue discussing, and we'll discuss more about a certain quarterback in Kirk Cousins. That's going to be a big topic of conversation for the Atlanta Falcons. What is the future of the Falcons quarterback position? And I think we got a little bit more clarity on that when it comes to Kirk Cousins with a unexpected restructure. And we'll break down what that restructure means for Kirk's future in Atlanta as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, if you've ever wished to be a pro quarterback and be drafted first overall by the Atlanta Falcons, well, you can now live out your dreams on the mobile game called the Ultimate QB Football Legend. Step in the cleats of a #1 overall draft pick at quarterback, lead your team to greatness, turning a failing franchise and leading them to glory as a dynasty. This is the #1 QB career mode game on the mobile app stores, and it introduces the most realistic environment for full career control. You can sign contracts, train and upgrade yourself, build chemistry with teammates, you know, make roster moves as a GM, play in actual games in 2D, and rise through the ranks to become a pro football legend. Ultimate QB is totally free to play, has no ads, and works 100% offline, perfect for when you want to sneak in that quick game or two on the go. Just head over to ultimate-qb.com. That's ultimate-qb.com, or search for Ultimate QB in your app store. And we've got something special for you guys. Use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store, and you'll get a free boost at the start of your career. Ultimate QB Football Legend, QB1, it's your legacy. Now, finding a doctor that you actually feel like is good for you can feel like discovering a diamond in the rough. You want to find someone in network nearby with availability, but you also want someone who listens, someone who makes you feel comfortable, explains things clearly, and helps you walk out of that office feeling confident about your next step. But your diamond in the rough exists, and you can find it with our sponsor today, ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so you can choose someone that you truly connect with. Being able to choose that in-person or video visits makes scheduling easier with ZocDoc, and the real-time availability means that you can book instantly and you don't have to worry playing phone tag with the doctor's office. So stop putting off your doctor's appointments by going to ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL to find and instantly book the doctor that you love today. That's ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL, ZocDoc.com/LockedOnNFL. Thanks to ZocDoc for sponsoring today's message. So before we continue today's episode, I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy, but you can level up your everydayerness by joining the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for $5 a month, $50 a year. You get, exclusive perks, including, an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons. If you hate the ads, you skip the ads, this is the perfect thing for you. So go check it out in the link in the description below. Now, let's talk about Kirk Cousins' restructured contract. According to ESPN, he did restructure his contract. We'll get probably more details, but I'll give my best interpretation and breakdown of what the details have been released so far. And I know some of you are asking, how can the Falcons restructure Kirk Cousins without a GM? Because the GM doesn't restructure contracts. The rest of the front office is still intact, guys. Like, this is not a situation where you cut the head off the snake and the body dies. Like, the rest of the body is still scurrying out there and doing whatnot. And the fact that this happened in the first week of January likely suggests that this was something that the Falcons were working on in the background, for the past few weeks. Now, essentially, this move puts Kirk on a path to being a post-June 1 cut and saving the Falcons money in March, which is something that wasn't the case before. It also gives them a hard deadline to make a decision on that, and that decision will likely result in Kirk's release, right? We've talked before about pre versus post-June 1 cuts, right? And there's been a debate on what the Falcons should do. Now, before the restructure, essentially it would have been a pre-June 1 cut. So if the Falcons just cut him normally like any team does in March, right, the Falcons would have saved $22 million against this year's cap. That's money that they can now spend in March in free agency. They would then eat about $35 million in dead money by making him that cut, but they would clear Kirk's contract completely off the books in 2027. They would basically eat all that dead money in 2026 and be, Kirk would cost them $0 in 2027. If they made him a post-June 1 cut before the restructure, the Falcons would save $35 million, but they would not get that cap savings until after June 1st. So June 2nd, they get that money when free agency is already pretty much wrapped up. And then they would still eat the $35 million in dead money. However, they would spread that over 26 and 27 with $22.5 million in 26 and $12.5 million in 27 as dead money. So Kirk's contract would still be hurting the Falcons in 2027. This is why you've heard me say, I don't think the Falcons are going to make Kirk a post-June 1 cut, because even though you save more money, those savings don't kick in until a point in the offseason when you can't really use that money. It's basically useless at that point in time in June, rather in March, right? But now with this restructure, the Falcons are essentially having their cake and eating it too, right? Where they're basically now going to save $33 million, right? And without cutting Kirk, right? Without the need to cut Kirk, they've already saved $33 million, money that they can now spend in free agency in March. And they can still, in theory, make him a post-June 1 cut in order to spread that $35 million in dead money, right? And they would also, in theory, still save about $2 million in cap space in June. So they would get an extra $2 million that they could use for, one veteran free agent, or to help them sign like 2 rookies or something like that. And they would still spread that $35 million across the 2 seasons, right? So it's having your cake and eating. You're getting the immediate cap savings that you would typically get of a post-June 1 cut, but you're getting that now in March and still can make him a post-June 1 cut. And so this is likely going to result in Kirk's release in March, because the reason why they were able to make this work is because they basically took $33 million that they're now saving in 2026 and moved it to 2027, right? And they made his salary in 2027 $68 million, which becomes fully guaranteed if Kirk is on the roster as of March 13th of this year. So basically, the Falcons by March 13th have to either release the hostage, which is Kirk Cousins, and give him his freedom as a free agent by cutting him, right? Or they have to be willing to commit to paying Kirk nearly $70 million in guaranteed money in 2027, which is basically, you're basically saying, Kirk, you're our quarterback for the next 2 years. We are committing to you for the next 2 years. So it's basically cut me or commit to me. That's basically why Kirk did this, right? And there's all likelihood the Falcons will cut Kirk, right? Rather than commit to him, right? Now, it's not guaranteed that the Falcons are going to cut him, because there's certainly a world where the Falcons hire a GM and a head coach that are basically like, we are willing to commit to Kirk Cousins, right? Particularly if they hire a coach like, Clint Kubiak or Kevin Stefanski that have worked with Kirk before. Or there's a mandate from ownership that, suggests that, the team needs to win right now. And Kirk gives you the best chance to win right now. And that's not a shot at Michael Penix. It's just because of the injury. He's a very big question mark for what he's going to give you in 2026, right? Is he going to play 17 games, or are you going to play 7 games? Is he going to play 3 games, or are you going to play 13 games? We don't know. And so, if ownership is like, you got to win now, and you're like, well, we got a quarterback that might play this year, we'll see. Like, I don't think that's going to fulfill the mandate. That's basically where we're at. So door number 1, Kirk. Door number 2, Michael Penix. Obviously, I think the Falcons are probably, this move suggests that they're going for door number 3, which is to cut Kirk and add a veteran option this offseason, right? That seems the likeliest outcome. But technically, door number 1 and door number 2 remain options for the team. It's on the table. It's basically the Falcons are basically making it so that they have to make a decision by March 13th. This decision is likely pointing to cutting Kirk, but they still have a way to basically, if they want to keep Kirk and pay him $25 million this year to be their starting quarterback, that option is available. It just comes with the caveat of you got to pay him like $70 million next year, right? So we'll see, right? That mandate from ownership is going to be a big part of it, right? Because, we're going to have ongoing conversations about that throughout the offseason, right? How big that mandate is, and that determines how much the Falcons are going to be willing to commit to this so-called bridge quarterback, right? Because if they're willing to commit significant resources to that player is not a bridge quarterback. He is the starting quarterback over, say, a Michael Penix. Or if it's just like, oh, we'll just get a guy and rent a guy on a cheap deal, and he'll start, 13 games, whatever it is, until Penix is ready. And so a lot of that's going to be determined by ownership. Ownership always has a say in the future of the quarterback position. So, I think some people are like, oh, Kirk did the Falcons a solid. It's not really a solid. It's quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. And basically, again, it's either commit to me for the next few years, or you just break yourself in and break yourself financially, or you cut me, right? And either way, Kirk is basically, in his agent and his representation is like, we're not going to get held hostage again, right? And if you do hold me hostage and keep me in 2027 in a world where you keep me as a backup quarterback, it's going to hurt you so bad, right? So it feels like the Glee meme of, I'm going to create an environment so toxic. That's basically what Kirk and his representation are saying. Like, if you don't cut me, it's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt you really, really bad. So, we're not going to do that again. It's basically what they're doing. So we'll see but again, I think the Falcons are likely headed in the direction of cutting Kirk. But, now that we have a little bit more clarity on Kirk's future, who's the potential GM that could be making that decision? We'll talk about Bears assistant GM Ian Cunningham, who's perhaps the top candidate to be the Falcons' next GM, and break down why he potentially could be the perfect fit, because he's the complete opposite of Terry Fontenot, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, Fridays already feel different during basketball season, and FanDuel is going to make them even better. Every Friday night before the game tips off, FanDuel is going to give fans a new way to kick off the weekend with NBA Happy Hour. NBA Happy Hour is your official pregame, a limited time window where special offers drop right inside the FanDuel app before the action starts. Fridays from 6 to 7:30 Eastern have become appointment viewing with NBA Happy Hour. Opening the FanDuel app during Happy Hour always brings something new, boost, bonuses, and surprises. It adds extra energy to Friday night basketball without overthinking it. So before tip-off, check out the FanDuel app and see what's dropping during NBA Happy Hour every Friday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. A little basketball, a little action, and a whole lot of Friday energy. That's NBA Happy Hour only on FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Now, have your health or family needs changed lately? Well, Georgia's got you covered. Georgia Access is our state's marketplace for Georgians to compare, apply, and enroll in health insurance plans that offer the best value for their individual needs. Open enrollment is happening now, still through January 15th, 2026. So you only have a few more days to sign up. So visit georgiaaccess.gov today. Again, georgiaaccess.gov today. Georgia Access, health insurance for Georgia by Georgia. So multiple reports indicate that Bears assistant GM Ian Cunningham has been formally requested for an interview for the Falcons GM vacancy, although there's a little confusion because the initial reports from guys like Jonathan Jones of CBS Sports and Tom Pelissero of NFL Media basically said he's interviewing for the GM job. But then later in the afternoon, that happened on Tuesday morning. Then later in the afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, Albert Breer of Sports Illustrated said he's in fact interviewing for the newly created president of football that we assume Matt Ryan is going to get. And he also indicated that he's also, Breer that is, Cunningham is also a GM candidate. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more clarity on that. And maybe as you guys are listening to that, you have gotten that clarity because other people have gone and, double checked and whatnot. So I imagine with that, in regard to that confusion, it feels like the Falcons are trying to kill two birds with one stone, where Cunningham being a minority, being black, they're going to get Rooney Rule compliant so that they can then hire Matt Ryan as president. And then simultaneously, like, well, since we're here, might as well, let's talk about what you would do, president of football, but also if you were the GM, that sort of thing. So, there's been other people that have been reporting that Cunningham is potentially the top candidate for the Falcons because of his experience with Chicago working under Ryan Poles, who's the Bears GM. Ryan Poles and Matt Ryan were teammates at Boston College, right? Poles was a 2-year starter at left guard when Matt Ryan was the starting quarterback at Boston College. And so people are connecting the dots that means because of Matt Ryan and Ryan Poles' strong connection and I won't say lifelong friendship, but being friends for the last 20 years, that gives Ian Cunningham the inside track, right? As we often know, it's a who business in the NFL. But in terms of what Ian Cunningham has a pretty impressive resume. Obviously, he spent the last 4 years with the Bears as the assistant GM, but prior to that was a personnel director, both I think in college and overall personnel under Howie Roseman with the Eagles. And then prior to that was an area scout with the Baltimore Ravens under Ozzie Newsome. So 2 very successful organizations that he worked with prior to, going to the Bears. And while I'm not the type of person that sits here and goes like, this is my top option, this is my top candidate, this is my wish list, whether it's head coaches or GMs, the fact that Cunningham has that Ravens background in his background, to me, checks a very big box that I want, because it's the opposite of what Terry Fontenot did. Because what I want in a general manager is going to be someone that has much more of a data-based approach to player evaluation than the gut/conviction-based approach that Terry Fontenot had, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, we have basically decades of data, like 40 years of data, that basically say the draft is a crapshoot, that your ability to discern talent from this player versus that player or from one team to the other is not really based off of a skill that you have. It's mostly luck based. And what I mean by luck, I mean there are so many variables and factors that determine whether a player is a prospect is a successful NFL player, factors and variables that are largely unpredictable, that it basically boils down to random chance. That's what I mean by luck, right? And the Ravens as an organization have understood this for the better part of 2 decades because they did their research. Right. I also did my research back in the day at Falcons and came to a similar conclusion that the Ravens and so many other, I think, successful NFL teams have concluded, which is basically your success drafting is not really based off of your ability to quote unquote out draft or out evaluate other teams. It's about getting more swings, right? More at bats. And the more swings you get, the more hits you're going to have. Right. And my research has basically confirmed this. Right. And there's been a lot of research over the last 40 years that suggests that this is true. Right. And so basically under Ozzie Newsome with the Ravens, they would do this by playing the compensatory pick formula. They get more picks. They would trade back consistently versus Terry Fontenot in the Atlanta Falcons and Mickey Loomis in the Saints, which was trading up a bunch, right? That their gut, their conviction told them that, oh, we think this guy is worth trading up for. And sometimes you hit on that, James Pierce being an example, but most of the time you don't. Ruka Roro, Matthew Bergeron being great examples. Now, I know including Bergeron as a miss or something like that is controversial, but I include him versus, say, an Arnold Ebiketie, who they also traded up in round 2 for, is because Bergeron hasn't outperformed any of the interior offensive linemen that were basically drafted after him. That if the Falcons had just stuck with that pick and took Cody Mock or Osiris Torrance at that in the mid-round rather than trading up for Bergeron, they probably would have gotten better results and also probably would have gotten a better player in round 4 than the nothing burger that they got in that regard. And so it's basically, again, data tells you that sometimes you do hit, but again, more often than not, you're going to strike out when you take that approach that Terry Fontenot has had. So essentially, to me, I want the next Falcons general manager to be much more of a data-driven, have that data-driven approach rather than what we've seen the last 5 years with Terry Fontenot, which, as we explained on previous episodes, makes sense when you have stability, in New Orleans with Sean Payton and Drew Brees at key critical positions, but never made sense for the Atlanta Falcons because they don't have that critical infrastructure that provides that stability to their organization. So if Cunningham takes that data-driven approach, which all signs indicate, because the Bears are a data-driven team, the Eagles are a data-driven team, the Ravens are a data-driven team, right? He spent 20 years basically in data-driven organizations. That's why I think Ian Cunningham should be at the top of your list in that regard. So I know with the Bears, they traded back like 3 times in this past year's draft. I think they traded back once. The only trade they had in 24 was a trade back, and then they obviously had the massive trade back from 2023 for the number 1 pick. As well. So they have certainly been a team that has been much more willing to trade back as opposed to trade up, which I think is perfect for the Atlanta Falcons moving forward. So, we'll see if Ian Cunningham is that top candidate. Tomorrow we'll potentially talk about Vance Joseph and why, he may potentially be the best option in terms of the competent coordinator as in contrast to the CEO type in John Harbaugh, right? He may be the most competent coordinator that we have available in this coaching cycle. So we'll discuss that potentially tomorrow. We'll talk about the other candidates that are vying for Matt Ryan's job as the president of football, right? We love the title. Love the title, Arthur Smith. I'm sorry, Arthur Blank. What? Oh, that's a Freudian slip. But we'll talk about whether or not those are serious candidates potentially, and we'll see what else, comes up. Right? Today's episode, I was like, oh, I'm going to talk about that stuff with the Kirk and the Ian Cunningham stuff. And then, an hour later, like the John Harbaugh news breaks. And I'm like, okay, this is the offseason, guys. It's always tough with the offseason because there's always developing stuff that's going on. It's like, oh, if I record at, a certain time, I won't get that news. And if so anyway, you guys don't care about the logistics of doing the podcast. All you care about is that it's available for you as your first listen each and every day. And I thank you for that and that trust and that confidence. So continue to make us your first listen on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL. You want to get the latest around the NFL. But of course, Locked On Ravens is going to have you covered for all the John Harbaugh stuff. Go check out all the other shows, Locked On Titans, Locked On Giants. And I'm sure all those people are saying why John Harbaugh is a perfect fit for them and all that sort of stuff. So get that comprehensive view here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And again, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below. $5 a month, $50 a year. You can get an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.